doing that thing where I say a man who needs no introduction. If, in the extremely unlikely event that you don't already know who Mr. John Romero is, you're about to find out more about him. So, guys, welcome.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. John needs no introduction. In fact, I have to say I'm not worthy. Seriously, I think, anybody, just about anybody here could probably kick my ass in most of your games, but I try, I really do. Thanks for coming today.
Yeah, this is cool. I like IndieCade a lot.
Right on. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to kind of, maybe we could open it up a little bit by talking about like indie and sort of the history of indie. One of the things that I think is really exciting about the work you're doing right now, both in your design work, but also in the archive, is kind of really archiving the first wave indie scene. And I'd really like to try to kind of get in there and get to the kind of core of what that scene's about and how like subsequently we were just talking and sort of talking about how you're sort of the second wave of indie and then third wave of indie. What does that mean? I mean, what is that history and what is indie?
Let's see. So I would say the first wave is like the early '80s guys that if anybody here takes game history classes, I know a bunch of you go to game colleges, and they sometimes have game history courses and stuff. I don't know how much of the early history they teach there, but back in the beginning of the industry, back in the late '70s and '80 through 83, the very first game companies in the industry were companies like Synapse Software, Serious Software, Verve, Sierra Online, Origin, that kind of stuff. And a lot of the games that those companies published were actually submitted by indies, or submitted by people who had made these games themselves at home, and they sent them in the hopes of getting recognized by these publishers. And these publishers were really pretty small companies that they didn't know that they should start a big business around this new computer thing because it was really risky. So they basically accepted these games and thought they were really good, and they put them out there and saw that they were people bought them. So they kind of kept on doing that. But they were all indie people at the beginning.
I mean, you kind of got your start there. I mean, even sort of on a different tier when you were submitting your games to Insider magazine, spelled IN space CIDER for Apple II, programming enthusiasts.
Nibble magazine.
Nibble, yeah, exactly. You kind of got your start in a kind of a sort of, I guess, second wave when Apple II came out.
Yeah, back in the early days, they weren't even game magazines. Back in the early days, the magazines for computers would publish programs, and people would type them into the computer, which is kind of nuts because there's a lot of code there, and you could screw up. Game code actually was a lot of code. If you were going to make a game and someone's going to type in a game, if it was any good, it actually had a lot of assembly language, and that is a lot of typing. And so they would usually reserve those for like December issues, like, ooh, Christmas time. The only fun you're going to get this year is in Christmas, and you're going to type in a game. So they would like publish the games, the big games at least, in December. They would publish those things, and that's like just tons of assembly language. But it was kind of funny back then. People would actually type stuff in from magazines. So that's how I kind of started. My first published game was a type-in game in 1984. And I published a lot of type-in stuff back then, but it was a different way of getting out there. I also published stuff on disc through other publishers, little publishers.
Yeah, I remember, I mean, I think this is the one thing that we have in common, with the exception of our fabulous hair, is just a sort of early interest in programming and really kind of through games and through the sort of different magazines. I used to, I think, Compute and a couple of other ones. I was
Commodore 64.
Yeah. And I sort of cut my teeth on the Atari 400, which also gave me blisters because it was,
membrane keyboard.
Yeah, that was tough. So I mean, I feel like there's some camaraderie there, just at least in terms of some of the
8-bit.
beginnings. Yeah. Do you still kind of go back to some of those early days and some of that?
Well, I haven't done any programming, but after Ian Bagos won a couple of awards last night with the 2600 game, I should go back and do some things.
Yeah, I think bringing out the old 6502 assembly could be actually interesting stuff.
Yep. Yeah, it's not too hard, but programming a 2600 is really hard. Unless you're really used to it, like Ian is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really curious. I mean, so from that kind of origin, clearly you started working in game companies, and then you started your own company, and that's kind of where, in many ways, your history oftentimes begins. People talk about it,
yeah, it was my fourth startup. So my first one was actually when I was 11, and I started programming games. I saw that all the games that I was playing were published by companies, you know, so I'm like, well, if I'm going to start making games, I better have a game company. So I came up with the name Capital Ideas Software, and that was named after a computer store that was close to me called Capital Computers. I used to go over there all the time and just play the latest Ziploc baggy games that they had gotten in. And then the first job I got in the industry was at Origin, and that was in 1987. And then after I left Origin, I started my second company, and then I started a third company, and then it was in 1991.
I mean, would you consider some of the stuff that you were doing, particularly id, where, you know, there's sort of stories of being kind of holed up in a house with pizza and Diet Coke, and just sort of generating your own ideas and kind of working really closely with the code. John Carmack, of course, you know, working alongside you on a lot of the programming. Would you consider that were you thinking of yourselves as kind of DIY, indie?
Not really, because probably like when we formed id, we had been all, like four of us individually, had been doing this for 10 years prior to that. So we're all pretty much experts when we all got together. And when we got together to form id, it was the first time any of us had worked with somebody else. So before that, the 80s were the lone programmer 80s. And so we all had programmed games by ourselves at home, and that whole hold up the pizza and Diet Coke was what we had done the whole time anyway. It's just that now we're doing it together in one space. But that was the first time that we'd ever worked with anybody else, and so it was like explosive, because it's like, wow, now we can do something really cool, and it's not just me, you know, it's not just him, it's all of us together, and we were all very complementary in our skill sets, and it worked out really well.
I think it's one of the things that's really interesting about kind of learning about those early days, and I've read Masters of Doom now, kind of read over the sort of early part a couple of times, because I think it's so interesting how you guys kind of designed, but programming seemed to drive a lot of the design. And what are your thoughts about that?
It was, well, the programming kind of drove the design, because we were starting to innovate in the programming side with the first like side-scrolling stuff that we had done with Commander Keen, because no one had done that on the PC, and the drive was to make a Mario game on the PC. So it was almost kind of design-driven, with the tech helping to be able to do that. But then past that point, when we started to do 3D, when we'd done Wolfenstein 3D, that was our third first-person game. We'd already done a game called Hover Tank a year before Wolfenstein came out, and then we did another. Our first texture-mapped game came out in November of '91, and but it was first-person, but it had like a wizard's hand coming out. It was like Catacomb 3D, and it just wasn't exciting. But we knew that perspective was really cool. Like that view was a good one, and we did that one in the EGA. So it's even harder to program texture mapping in EGA than it is in VGA. And then we finally did Wolfenstein. We did it with guns and VGA, and that was the winner right there.
I mean, so you were influenced in a lot of ways to try to get the side-scrolling stuff to work by the Nintendo and by Mario. What influenced you when you started thinking about first person?
Let's see. I think that back in 1990, I kept in touch with Paul Murath, who was a guy who created Looking Glass Technologies, and I worked with Paul at Origin. And when I was at Origin, Paul had asked me to help co-found that company, but I had already promised someone else to co-found a different company the week before. But I kept in touch with Paul over the years, and Paul in 1990, when I was talking to him on the phone, he had told me that they were making a game that used this new technique called texture mapping, and he explained it was basically taking a texture, putting it on a polygon, and I had asked Carmack. I told Carmack, hey, look at what they're doing, and then he basically thought about it for 3 seconds and said, yeah, I could do that, and he actually didn't do it for a whole year after that. But during that time, he started to get used to 3D programming. So we knew that to do the texture mapping, we'd have to start doing 3D, and that seemed like that's where things were starting to go in that direction. Like games were starting to go in that direction with like LHX, Attack Chopper, and just other various build polygon type games like Starglider 3 and that kind of stuff. So we knew that was going to be the new world. Like 3D was going to be the new world, but like the 3D that we'd seen was not really fast, and so our focus was on speed. So taking the idea of texture mapping, first trying to get used to making 3D games, and then starting to do the texture mapping in there and do it all super fast. That was kind of our focus.
Right. I'm interested. I mean, I think one of the conscious decisions you made when you first started releasing, the trifecta series, right, from Wolfenstein to Doom to Quake, is this idea of releasing also level editors and kind of opening things up for a player community. What influenced that? I mean, I guess I'm trying to get like underneath the surface of this idea of that was sort of brought up in the punk rock motherfucker session about DIY culture and sharing kind of methods, but at the same time, really, the fan base, the player base is as much kind of creative as you guys are.
Okay, so back in the 80s, I used to make tools to make my games. So I was always writing tools and having them make my games. I didn't really want to use a text editor or just put mazes in there as letters or whatever. I always wanted to see my games graphically. So I had written a bunch of editors back then, so I was used to writing tools with the games. And being a designer, programmer, I was always the one to kind of glue those two worlds together and make it so it was easier for designers to make things in the world. Instead of the programmer saying, "Oh, you need these things," and then like as a designer, like, okay, those are hard to use in the editor. It was always about trying to make it really easy for the designer. And so I always had the mindset of like design, make it easy, make it happen. And I also have a philosophy that I really hate a lot of files. I like the game, executable, and a data file with a million things in it. I want to copy 2 files, or one, even better on a Macintosh. So, I really don't like having a million things out there. But when there's a million files out there, they're easy to edit and modify. But I didn't like the mess. So we had written tools to make all of the files go into one thing, but that makes it kind of inaccessible to people. And then even worse, to make the games fit on floppies, we had to compress them. So compression adds another layer of difficulty in accessing the actual data. When Wolfenstein came out, that was a game that got really, really popular, more so than the other stuff, Command & Keen stuff. And I started to hear about people, they basically figured out how to get into the level files for Wolfenstein by taking the executable and getting the Huffman dictionary out of the LZ executable, and basically taking the files out and then trying to make an editor to edit them and try to put them back in the same format so the game would run it. And I was like, these people are going through some horrendous lengths to try and get levels in the game. So basically with Doom, it was like, let's just make it really easy for everybody to edit stuff. We'll give them the formats of everything. I still want to keep a big file, but let's give them the formats for everything and open up as much as we can. And that's what we did, and then everybody could basically modify our games.
So I guess we could draw a line between 2 chords in punk music and 2 files in kind of punk aesthetic. But I kind of want to take that metaphor a little bit further and ask you a little bit about music, because I know heavy metal and was